welcome to the Theology Pugcast, and we are back online. Our last 4 shows were live shows, and it was great to be reminded that Glenn and Tom are not merely talking heads on my computer. They actually are physical and have bodies and occupy space and time. And I do too, but we are separated by space. I am here in the Pacific Northwest. Just to introduce myself, I'm C.R. Wiley. I am a pastor. I've been a college professor. I've been a real estate investor. I've been a building contractor. And I write books. And I'm working on a book that Glenn's wife has been bugging me for years to get done. And I am in the last few days of wrapping it up. So anyway, Lynn, if you're there and listening, be encouraged. At that point, when I'm done, I'm turning it over to the publisher, and then you can bug them because it'll be out of my hands. It'll be in their hands.
You do know, though, that it's a trilogy, and this is only book 2.
Yeah, and here's a nice thought. There's another cliffhanger. Anyway, that's enough about me.
So, Chris, do you practice the evil laugh?
I do. It's actually, while I'm writing the book, I'm laughing maniacally. Anyway, so it's Tom's day. So why don't we wait on Tom? Why don't you introduce yourself, Glenn, and then we'll go to Tom.
I'm Glenn Sunshine. I am a retired professor or professor emeritus of history from Central Connecticut State University, senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, and new thing, effective September 1st, I am going to be working in Reflections Ministries, which is the organization headed by Ken Boa.
Yeah.
And we're really working on a title for exactly what it is that I'm going to do. But it's research, writing, teaching, some editing, things like that. And one suggestion was, if we refer to Ken as the Grand Poobah, maybe I would be the Petty Poobah. The advantage that it alliterates.
Nice.
But anyway, I will be working with Ken effective September 1.
Well, that's great. We'll say hi to Ken. Ken's a friend of the show. We've had him on, and it's great to see that all developing. Anyway, Tom, tell us about yourself, and then get us right into the subject of the day.
Okay, Tom Price, a systematic theologian, Christian ethicist. I teach both at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary and a few other places. And I am writing this summer, and I will be unpacking as it takes fuller shape what's going on. But it's exciting from my end. I've been able to fuse a few things and start thinking through something I've been thinking about for a long time. So more on that as we get closer. So topic of the day. This is part 3 of a podcast trilogy on meaning and history. We've been floating around this idea a lot and been coming at it from a lot of different angles. And the reason I even picked the topic is because I think it's sometimes taken for granted that the way in which we comprehend history, providence, and meaning oftentimes is a hodgepodge of different currents and forces and ideas. And then we find ourselves, especially in the church, not knowing sometimes even how to properly engage a period of time in which the church's way of thinking about scripture and history is at fundamental odds with everything else in the culture. And increasingly, the church is adopting a lot of the ideas of the culture. And so,
to this point, we had a young woman who's working on her PhD, I think, write us, and I saw you responded to her, Tom. And she sounds like a very intelligent young woman, and she was her remark, if I remember correctly, is kind of the imminent frame is just completely taken for granted, and the stuff that we're talking about, is stuff that she's not had anybody talk to her about before. And I don't know where she's doing her work.
It looked, I don't want to give away too much on her behalf, but it looked like a place at which she should have been getting some significant Christian input, at least from the Catholic tradition. But one of the things I think that was remarkable is that she had an antenna for how this was impacting the particular field of international relations in particular. And this is something a long time ago I was involved with during my student doctoral days. I was a good friend of mine, Peter Petkoff, developed the Oxford Society of Law and Religion, in which the O'Donovans, Oliver O'Donovan and his wife Joan Lockwood, were a big part of in those early days. And they were really dealing and grappling with this stuff, in particular with the Reformation contribution. I think Bonds of Imperfection was one of the works that they put out together right around that time. But this is, I think that's an area, as I was telling her, that it's just, I wouldn't even know where to begin in terms of resources for that. But I did find one in which, I'll have to get the title, maybe our audience would be interested, in which it traced, in particular, nominalism and its huge impact on the way in which Christians actually developed a lot of their modernist-leaning approaches to international relations. And so they would be curious to kind of see where people go with engaging that from a more comprehensive Christian view of transcendence and meaning.
Yeah. Good stuff.
And one thing that I would throw in as a historian, I think as a Christian historian, I would say we need to understand the fact that God is sovereign and is working out his will through all the events that occur. But because as a finite human being, I don't have access to the mind of God at that level, God works primarily through secondary causes. And as a historian, it's my job to understand the secondary causes.
Right.
Getting behind that to the inscrutable will of God and his purposes is kind of a different field. That's sort of to work with.
Yeah, and I think that's an important distinction. I probably should have made it even the first episode. When I'm talking about history and meaning, I'm not really talking about the practice of doing historical research in particular. Because what goes on there or should go on there is actually, and this is big debate in the area of history and history of philosophy of history, is exactly how do we approach this? Do we import all our biases? Do we try to be detached? Those are typical debates that go on in just about every field of inquiry now. But you're exactly right. There are certain things, secondary causes, facts, and things like that are going to have kind of the preponderance of the focus. It's then when we move from that to interpreting that history and then moving into interpreting the significance of that history. So this is where we're kind of shading the area of fact and value at this point. And so, for example, in classical approaches to reading the scripture, I'm talking patristics and medievals, look very different in their approach to reading the historical dimensions than, say, someone influenced by, Schweitzer or Strauss or Spinoza in these different figures. And so they have contributions to make, but a lot of time we very impacted by these later figures have lost any touch with those earlier figures, thinking they're just outmoded and outdated and didn't understand the meaning of history in any significant way.
Well, the reason why that gets particularly ironic is because these were people who lived in a world in which everything was understood as having meaning. Yeah. And since they were used to looking at the world around them and finding meaning in even the smallest things, why would you expect them to do otherwise when they studied history? Of course, they're going to find meaning in history. We're the ones who actually have abandoned the idea that history does have any meaning. In a lot of ways, buying into Mark Twain, it's just one damn thing after another.
Right. Yeah. In that kind of natural. Go ahead, Chris.
Well, I think sometimes when people criticize thinkers from antiquity or from the medieval world, they more or less do so with the the kind of the presupposition that these people are obvious, in their minds, obviously reading meaning into things, and that essentially things don't have meaning, and that you can't really rely on them even for factual data. When they talk about when something happens, they can't. They just are just kind of so I guess caught up in their theology or philosophy that even the facts get muddied. But I'm actually
today.
That's right. That's right. I'm actually working my way again through Augustine's City of God. And if you recall, like the first three books are nothing but history. He's recounting events, and he's actually thinking about the meaning of these events, but he's doing so in the sense that he's using these terrible catastrophes and these wars from Rome's past to demonstrate that the gods that they worship didn't do anything for them. And so, since that's the case, why blame the Christians for the sack of Rome by the Visigoths? You guys have had Rome has been sacked plenty of times, and you never had us to blame. You only had, but I think that the interesting thing is there's a lot of great information about Roman history right there in those first three books. Now, of course, he's quoting Livy and Cicero and others, but that's the thing that's also interesting to me as I'm looking at Augustine doing his work, and he's quoting these pagan authors. These pagan authors are just as I guess critical of when it comes to Rome's past as any modern historian would be. They're pointing out the moral failures of certain leaders, the sort of the secondary causes that led to these events, all this kind of stuff. So the ancients were able to work at that level too.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the things, and that we've been kind of unpacking, and then we talked about the way in which Christianity kind of introduces this linear vision, if you will, of history. It's not simple a cycle of recurring events. And again, this is a large scale assumption. This shouldn't be affecting every historian's research per se. But like you say, someone can note facts and things that happened without having this larger providential frame, if you will, of meaning in which you start to, like Augustine starts to read these particular things. But I think one of the things we noted is there is in this introduction of Christianity is that history is going somewhere, that purposes are moving towards fulfillment or judgment. Natures are going to reach their culmination in the redemptive work of Christ, and of course the second coming in its fullness. And so things are not just going to be a continuous pattern, but they are actually going to move to completion. And so in the Old Testament figure of prefigurement and fulfillment, we have again a certain kind of foretaste and consummation. This is kind of a Christian vision of things. And so you do have starting to roll into the mindset of the world from Christianity this notion that there can be history moving. There's a telos, and their history is moving towards something. And so the pursuits of what Christians do in terms of the glory of God and love of their neighbor have significance towards this culmination, and of course things thereafter in some way. And so what we do as historical agents starts to take on significance too, in a way that we're not just ideas, instantiations of ideas, which really are just like everything else, but we actually have, with our gifts and endowments, something that's a part of this, as they use, grand drama. And so a lot of things change that are introduced with Christianity, the dignity and meaning of what we do. Reformation brings it up with like vocation, right? How else would your vocation matter if you weren't really part of this interactive drama? And so that became kind of very significant. Well, then we started to talk about the modern world in which a lot of those things that Christianity brought were repeated and continued, but they were radically altered. And that's when we were talking about when the Christian vision of transcendence became eclipsed and another version came in, an immanence and the now and kind of really a fusion of primary and secondary causes into the same level. I mean, that's Spinoza, right? Then the naturalistic, immanent, secular, if you will, interpretation of history now as somewhat linear from Christianity, but without the Christian God, Christian view of transcendence, and everything else. So you have variations. What is a secular view of liberal view of moral progress in society? But a taking of Christianity, moving somewhere, moving towards a telos. But for them, it's undefined, right? They don't have the created order to measure it by, whether things are consistent with it or not. So it's just change for change's sake, or our present consciousness becomes kind of the measure for whether or not, we're on the right side of things.
Right. The interesting thing, Os Guinness talked about this, particularly the similar idea in connection with vocation. And he said that there is a Catholic heresy about vocation, that the only things that are truly vocations are calling to the priesthood or to become a nun. But he says there's a Protestant heresy that comes from the doctrine of calling as well. And that's the thing that makes your secular calling absolute.
Yeah.
This is what leads to people living for their job, sacrificing family, sacrificing everything else for their career. That is a Protestant heresy on calling. And the difference between the two is, I suppose, the Catholic heresy overemphasizes the transcendent frame. The Protestant heresy throws everything into the immanent.
Yeah,
so this is Os Guinness who said that?
Yeah.
Do you remember how long ago he said that? Because it seems very relevant to the moment we're in.
I'm guessing maybe 10 years ago. It's in a book called The Call.
Oh, I remember that book. Right.
Yeah.
Okay, actually, it's my assistants over here are mouthing, it's older than that. Yeah.
Well, you come across this particular heresy in coastal cities where believers looking to sort of justify their total commitment to their careers will refer to them as kind of their vocations in the sense that you just described, Glenn. And that's why they can't get married, and that's why they are working 12 to 14 hours a day, and that's why they don't ever leave the office, is because they really do think of this as the kingdom of God. This is their way of contributing to the kingdom of God.
And these are ways in which, and this is something I was after with I think the last show. These are ways in which the good thing Christianity introduced, when it gets ripped out of its proper theological setting and it gets unleashed within a new metaphysic and theology, even if it's subtle, it starts to introduce things that, as they continue down the altered path, they end up creating these kind of heresies. That's what they are. They're Christian, they're turning, they're taking something Christian and turning with it. And so, you see this. And so what you have is a church filled with a completely immanent frame view of the kingdom. And
wouldn't we say, Tom, that this is maybe contributing even to the woke phenomenon? In other words, if we think about justice as having to be realized perfectly now, then we can justify all kinds of injustice in its name. Whereas if we have a sense that justice is always going to be approximate in our world, we should strive to get as close to the ideal as possible, but it'll never be perfectly realized because we can't sort out the wheat from the chaff, the weed from the wheat. It's just not possible.
Yeah. Yes, I think that's exactly right. And I'm going there. So let me kind of maybe back to do a couple steps back, then we can kind of get back to that point, because I think, this is something we are currently dealing with. So the next step is the emancipatory histories. How in the world do we get these notions of history, especially in a secular time and in an immanent frame, that history is dynamic, alive, it has a telos, if you will, and your aim is to be part of that process of bringing about, if you will, this utopia or liberation or emancipation. Now, again, let's back up. Christianity introduces a linear view of history and a redemptive view, one in which there is genuine liberation from idolatry and all that goes with it, and the loves being malformed and the like. So carry those things over, baptize them not into Christ, but into a secular frame or immanent frame. You still have liberation, redemption. You still have these things, but they take on a secular, this worldly dimension, and they're ripped out of divine action, which is sort of a transcendent act in time, to God all of a sudden becoming dynamic within history, becoming basically a bigger agent within history, in which, when we align with, through our historical action, we are realizing the kingdom of God, the utopia, or the like. Now, there's a long way to get to that, and I don't want to trace all of that, but I think a couple steps are worth noting. German idealism in particular played a large role.
The Germans
Kant,
again. The Germans.
Those.
It's always the Germans.
Well, I think we can actually push it back to Rousseau, but we won't go there.
Yeah,
French too.
That's
French and the Germans.
Right. Yeah, that 24% of French German in me, I've got to kind of. So what you had going on, especially with German idealism, was this. You had Kant, of course. We talked about Kant, who divides kind of the thing, knowing reality as it is in itself versus our receiving the phenomena. So for Kant, you can't really know if there is a teleological order out there. All you can know is what impresses itself on you and what your consciousness and categories of thinking put back on the world. So we are now removed from any kind of direct encounter with the world, and now human consciousness and the structures of our thought are kind of everything. So meaning now is something we have a share in, basically generating or creating or producing, right? So no longer is it a field of agents in which we truly are objectively engaged, but now we are all radically subjectively engaged, and our subjective side is doing a lot more work with Immanuel Kant now.
Well, before you jump ahead, I think that it would be good to help the folks out in podcast land kind of get a little sort of some handles on what you just talked about, Tom, because one of the big things that I remember I had to grasp to understand modern philosophy was the paradox of its quest for objective knowledge and its retreat into the subjective at the same time. There's this kind of weird dynamic. So when we think about Kant, there are a lot of folks out there who would think of Kant as being the champion of reason and a champion of objective reality. What you just described is something that I think most folks are unaware of, and that is Kant is actually one of the kind of the villains in terms of the subjective turn. So one of the ways I remember helping my students understand this when I was teaching philosophy is for Kant, you've got all of this sense data, which is just kind of bombarding our consciousnesses, right? There's no sort of like form that is sort of adhering and giving those realities outside our heads meaning and a kind of a status that we could apprehend. Instead, we just have all this data flowing in it and through our eyes and ears and so forth. And our minds work as sort of like a sorting machine. So like I remember when I was a waiter for a time, and I saw. This is back in the day when people actually would pay with cash. So you get some dollar bills and some coins and things like that. And we had these coin sorters. I don't know if you've ever seen these. They're like just it's just gravity, and you pour your change in the top, and then the way the coin sorter is set up, everything kind of just falls into place, right? That's the human mind, according to Kant. The human mind is like a coin sorting machine. So it's your mind that is bringing the meaning to the data. See, this is what a lot of folks don't get. So what that means then is that we can't get out of our heads. In other words, Kant is as subjective as you get. But there's a kind of intersubjectivity because he believes that we all have the same coin sorting machine.
well, that's right. This is a big set of terms. This is his theory of kind of transcendental unity of apperception. I mean, that's the whole point of that, is that there is a transcendental consciousness, if you will, that we all share in, and that unifies our categories of thought, so that when we interpret things, we can't have rational debate and discourse because we all have the same kind of rational functions grounded in that transcendent unity of apprehension.
And that's what postmodernism has attacked and undermined.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. And actually, I'm going to pull us back to the 17th century. The roots of these ideas go back to John Locke.
Aha. Yeah. Well, that's true. Locke, with the tabula rasa.
Locke argued that we were born as blank slates, tabula rasa. We accumulate sensory experience, and our mind sorts them out, organizes them, and so on. There are no intrinsic structures in the human mind, according to Locke. Now, that's where Kant differs from him, because you have this transcendental sorting machine.
Right.
But the basic root is the tabula rasa and accumulated sense perception.
Right.
That's right. And so what happens in a weird way is kind of those things get fused together, because it becomes all immanent, like Locke, if you will, other than his kind of his psychological. The soul is basically a psychological bundle or something with Locke. But what you end up having is that you have kept the human contribution to things through their consciousness of meaning. But that starts to move away from the transcendent to the immanent in due time. And so what basically Hegel is, I guess, the next best step here. Because what Hegel says is, well, when Kant says there is this a meaning that is out there we have no access to other than the sense data, and that's the phenomena that we experience, and then we are interacting with the phenomena, and that's all we can know. Hegel basically says, why not just erase the thing in itself and move back to Aristotle, where our consciousness actually engaged with the phenomena is the whole of reality? Why talk about this thing we don't have access to? If we don't have access to it, it really isn't anything that we're dealing with. So that's where you have this next step in German idealism with Fichte and some of these other figures, where basically human self-consciousness, human consciousness and its experience of things is really the whole grid. And so this gets read up transcendentally, is that there is basically this is German idealism, there is a self-consciousness that is really reality. So this is not materialism, this is idealism, that the stuff that everything is self-consciousness, and we are manifestations of that. And so we, participating in it, are the creators and generators of meaning in finite form, as modeled on that infinite self-consciousness that is behind everything, right? Now we have mind that is everything, if you will. So now we have also mind thinking, which means that there is a telos and meaning in history, but the only way we have access to it is not through scripture and natural revelation, but is through our own development of thought and engagement with other ideals. Now, there are some very messy pictures here, because this isn't Aristotle's way of thinking in terms of old dialectic. This is clashing dialectic. This is where I have a thought, and my society has thoughts we share in a certain kind of part of self-consciousness. But self-consciousness is not perfect and absolute. It's unfolding. So the divine mind in this view, if you will, is not an absolute God like Christianity, but is a God that is becoming through thinking out his thoughts and them coming to life. God's actualizing himself through thinking, right? And so God thinks the USA, if you will, and then God thinks Russia, if you will. I'm thinking the old Russia. And these two clash, and with this clash, there is a new synthesis, a new bursting of meaning. And so what was for me, USA, what was for Russia, were the final thing, turns out to be that they weren't. And so everything is dynamic. All meaning is relative and conditioned by the absolute realizing itself at that moment. And so we're moving in a whole different direction than Christianity, yet we're running with very Christian and even some Aristotelian things ripped from their old metaphysics. So let's just kind of jump ahead. Emancipatory viewpoints of history start to develop because we start to see that human beings are agents of meaning. And there is this belief that these are heading towards an actualization or full realization of the divine. This is what becomes utopia eventually. God finally will figure it out and realize himself, and everything will be reach this equilibrium. Marx comes along and says everything isn't mind, it's the other way around. So all of our structures of consciousness and categories of thought are not the generators of the meaning. They're expressing the socioeconomic situation, the material conditions. They have been eternalized, and now they're projected by us. And so what we have, and what we do is we become alienated, if you will, when these things are not at a certain point of equilibrium. And so this is where you start to develop the material conflicts in history, which are necessary to finally reach this material utopia in due time. And so your thoughts now, until they've reached utopia, are such that they are things at a given point that will need to be overcome. They will need to be violently overcome if it's holding back that movement of nature and towards its goal. And so you have a radical alteration of meaning in history.
Yeah, let's just pause there. They have to be violently overcome. In other words, because we're talking about a materialist system, and we consider human thought kind of epiphenomenal, just sort of the expression of a particular economic system or moment in time.
Yes, that's right.
Consequently, what you end up with is a situation where the material conditions have to be altered before the consciousness can be altered.
Yeah.
And that means that it's got to be some kind of clash that brings about the next phase of human or social evolution or social development. It's not reasoned out. It's not something that occurs deliberatively, like Hegel would still have room for, or actually it was very much part of what he's up to, and definitely not dialectic in the way Plato and Aristotle thought about it.
That's right. I mean, but you can have you have two different strands of Hegel. You have the left wing and the right wing, but the more conservative Hegelians tend to value highly institutions, countries, cultures, language. You could say Herder and a lot of those figures that were part of the retrieval, the Romantic retrieval, and their notion of the significance of each culture and its language and its thoughts really came from that. And you can see even today, you'll have different even Christian writers that really see the contribution of Hegel to the significance of formed freedom. That freedom is not this arbitrary and autonomous kind of thing, but is actually something that is cultivated through these kind of manifestations of form that are given by the absolute realizing itself, if you will. Then you have the kind of left wing, and in a sense, from what I've been reading a lot of, is the kind of move to the new left, and Glenn could probably speak more on this, is something they often call by a couple of names in the stuff I've been reading. One is a Hegelianizing Marxism, which I think is a thing where this new left kind of is softening to some of what Hegel had to say, but still with Marxian impulse. Others will call it a more humanistic kind of Marxism because they return to the early Marx, which was about freedom and human dignity in their reading of Marx, like Marcuse's reading of Marx. But one of the things I think you do see is you start to move from Marxism and Hegel and Kantian kind of liberalism, is you start to see this disenchantment with these grand narratives start to take place, these grand meaning narratives. And this is where you start to have this kind of the entry point for the woke kind of stuff. We've talked many times about postmodernism's critique of these grand narratives, that what we have is these huge stories that basically absorb every little particular into them and demand everything get its meaning from the imposition of that grand story. And so one of the things that postmodernism wants to do is really show the way in which, and there is a little truth here, that each one of these things is contingent. In most of their ideas and stuff are not grounded in some eternal foundation, if you will, but are grounded in humans and ideas and institutions and forcings and things like that. So they shouldn't have, in their mind, the kind of imperial force that they aim to have. And so the early postmoderns, figures that someone like Richard Rorty would be a part of, if you could call him that, this pragmatic type, they saw this as a moment of liberation that was going to usher in this new stage in which everyone was basically going to have their narratives and get along, like Marx's utopia, fishing and whatever else, all day long. Didn't happen. And so what happens, especially in the U.S.,
it did. Just think about your typical family and the argument over whose turn it is to do the dishes. That they thought that this could be sort of conflict free. You could have your story, Tom. I could have my story. Glenn can have his story, and nobody ever has to do anything they don't want to do or sort of fit into any story that's not their own sort of imagination story. They're out, their own story. It's just nuts. It's just
What I find interesting is when you go back to Hegel. It struck me how similar it is if you're putting it in a more orthodox-leaning theistic term. It strikes me as how similar it is to process theology and probably open theism as well.
Yes.
Yeah, those guys definitely are definitely drawing from this stuff. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think you can see with process theology in particular, this dynamic of history and the need, it's panentheism, this need for the deity because the deity is not complete and absolute. The doctrine of classic Christian doctrine of aseity is thrown out the door. So God's being is in becoming. That was famous language of that time. So God's being is realizing itself.
Yeah, I actually have an acquaintance, somebody that I suppose I could call a friend, who's a leading open theist theologian, guy named Tom Ord. And Tom is very, very committed to the idea that time itself is not relative, it's absolute. And it's actually something that God is subject to. So God is consequently, as is in contingent. His being is being sort of developed or worked out within the contingency of history. And also that means there are things that God just doesn't know. God doesn't know the future, according to Tom.
And notice what's going on there. This is kind of what I was trying to get at a few different times. Is time or history is the large circle to which even God is an agent within, but just a bigger agent than the other, contingent agent, but just a bigger one than the rest of it. This is that move out of classic views of transcendence to now bringing God within that circle. But in this case, the circle is not the summum bonum, the ultimate good, for example, or set of eternal forms. This circle is time. And time is absolute. God isn't.
Mm-hmm.
And so that brings God into the stage of interactive dynamic with creation. This is what the free willers always love, because it makes God have to be interactive. In other words, classic Christian view, God can be fully active, whether we're passive or active or not, right? Work out your salvation with fear and trembling. What's the next thing? For it is God that works in you. And so, or for those that received him, to them he gave the power to become the sons and daughters of God. Okay, we do the receiving. There's a human active act. But then he says, but it is not your will that generated it, nor the will of man or anything else, but but God.
Yeah,
so they're mm-hmm.
Yeah, this can actually work out in some interesting ways at the level of folk theology. So sometimes you'll come across people who say something that sounds really pious, but when you think about it, you're like, it's tremendously sort of it's even blasphemous. Like the statement I've heard many times: God does nothing but an answer to prayer. Now, maybe God, in his ordering of things, prompts you to pray so that he can answer your prayer. Maybe that's one way to redeem that statement. But the idea that God is just sort of sitting around all day waiting for us to ask him to do things, because our relationship with him is on equal terms. We have a genuine relationship. God doesn't do anything that I've not asked him to do. Well, God made the world without my asking. Or maybe for these people that didn't happen.
Well, it's interesting because this, in theology in particular, you have you see this also with feminist theology and liberation theologies. Is they love this move to turn the relationship, the creature's relation to God, to not one of absolute dependence. I mean, you can see with feminism, if creation, the female, is dependent on creator, the male, then it means that they have no being or anything else apart from. I mean, this is their kind of twisted thinking, that underwrites a certain kind of patriarchy and everything else. So they want basically a more feminized view in which God is God is the spirit that fits the earth or creation, which is the glove, right? So God needs the glove, the dress, if you will, in order to be God. And so this is that move towards God basically being superior to, bigger than the creation, but needing the creation in order to manifest and realize himself. So all of a sudden, we're back to paganism, where God needs the creation to be God. And what that does is that puts a burden on creation that the gospel meant to liberate us from. The liberation of the gospel was to free us from having to basically assuage the gods that we created in our idolatry and the religious enslavement that we got tied into by doing that. So Christianity frees us and says, this is all gift all the way down, and God doesn't need you to be God, and God doesn't create to put the burden on you to realize God's being. God is complete in everything else. That gives us the freedom of having to basically be servants of God rather than friends, if you will, in that kind of thinking. And so Hegel, panentheism, feminized theology and liberation theologies put a huge burden on the creature now to have to be the agent of realizing God's purposes in history, right? And this purpose of liberation, of course, is undoing the patriarchy for the feminist, and it's undoing anything that is classically Christian for the liberation theologian. And all in the name of a higher new humanity. And the engine drive is the human being moral agency being active in the world, changing it rather than understanding it. And so now you have a church where, again, committed to social justice. We should be committed to social justice properly understood. That belongs to Christianity, the term itself. It grew out of Christian moral teaching. That does not belong to the left. that does not arise in it. But this whole commitment of the church to a completely imminent frame through which their actions are going to usher in this new state of humanity is not Christian.
I think it's a good thing for us to kind of help our listeners pick up on some maybe ways of thinking and talking that don't use the terms that we're using right at the moment, but are dependent upon these ways of thinking, maybe even unconsciously. So there's a strong we've talked about this a little bit. When we, hear people just, talk about contextual theology, for example.
Yeah.
Contextual theology, in one sense, is, irrefutable. I mean, you got to learn a language if you're going to minister in a country. So
Yeah,
you got to
that's
learn
right.
kind of the context. It's good. It's a good idea to know a little bit about the customs and so forth. But contextual theology can be so embedded in the immanent, the way it can sort of conceives of God's work in the world, that there's apparently no way of even talking about transcendence in the way that we try to promote on this show. It's just like
Yeah.
that's just because they beg the question. That's just you and me, a bunch of white guys imposing our deceptive sort of framework on other people, rather than actually helping them to sort of look outside to something that's outside of us as well, that's beyond us.
That's right. I mean, if there's any theology that actually pulls the rug under a white supremacist view of Christianity, it's the proper view of transcendence. It's that the particular creaturely form is not, in any sense of the word, the full reality. And what they do in attempt to alleviate that straw man is create a particular contextualized idol in its place in order to, again, this is what ends up happening when any creaturely formed context becomes determinative of the transcendent. And see, this is what Christianity was able to move brilliantly, even though it had its tensions, from the Hebraic into the Hellenic, and not in such a way that it imprisoned itself in either of those. But there is this full-fledged communication of that the stuff that came through the Hebraic into the Hellenic, in which it continued to purge those parts that were inconsistent with it and develop those parts that help communicate it fuller. And that became the groundwork for the church to talk about ways in which we can communicate contextually. We can use language and customs and different things, but not in a way that it gets imprisoned into that kind of thinking. Look, I'm all for being exposed by the truth of Christianity for those idols that I have or my culture has or the church in my time. I think the heart of Christianity is being uprooted from any false gods and any fallen securities and replaced with the truth. And I think that's what you're not going to get from these altered theologies, because they have turned the creaturely and the contingent as a replacement of the classical transcendent. I mean, that's a big thing to unpack. But let me take it a little different direction. But I know we're going to be wrapping up very soon. But when, especially in the U.S., you had kind of in the academic world, you had this breakdown of these grand narratives, and you had the postmodern play for a while. All of a sudden, the postmodern took on a seriousness, and we've talked about this in other shows as well, where it no longer was happy with play. But you really saw an uptick, especially in the U.S., with this moving out of the academy into the popular culture, right around the time that basically, I think the 2008, when you had the economic crisis. Because basically, once the grand narratives that gave us meaning in society were basically looked at very negatively, Christianity increasingly losing its kind of place on the hold of the moral fabric of society, in these other grand liberal narratives that were moving endlessly toward progress. That disenchantment, at least, was if nothing filled it, people thought, okay, well, I have a wealthy future, and I have, I'm going to be able to basically indulge myself. Well, when the economic crash happens, we don't have that anymore, right? So now you have a whole generation who doesn't have the grand narrative. They don't have the substitute, bread alone. So now what? And then these things flood that vacuum. These kind of wokeism and radically altered postmodernism that adopts a lot of the new left into this new metaphysic, if you will, and new history of meaning in which things now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's as though we can't get away from having a meta narrative. We've got to have a meta narrative. Yeah. The question is whether or not it's the correct or the true story, not whether we can have one or not. I think this is where all this stuff just is evidently, unworkable. You got to have. Getting back to my little illustration of whose turn is it to do the dishes tonight. There's always going to be stuff that you're required to do that you don't want to do if this thing is going to work. If we're going to live with each other.
Yeah.
There are going to be things that I get to do that maybe you want to do, but you can't do for one reason or another. There are going to be things that you can do that I can't do for one reason or another. How do we make sense of that? Is it just power games? Is nature really just Play-Doh? I mean, you do have a uterus and I don't. I can't be a mother unless we play some kind of goofy language game, which we're
birthing. You can't be a birthing. Yeah. What do they call it?
Birthing person. Yeah, which apparently is actually something people are willing to do. I listened to something on Quillette here last week that was really disturbing, but also fascinating in a sort of disturbing way. And there's this sort of, if there was any group of people that you would think would be able to keep all this stuff sorted out, it would be, midwives. But apparently there's some of the worst people out there when it comes to this sort of gender language nonsense. And they have a very short sort of distance between being really sweet, nice little ladies and being woke, sort of mobs. It's just amazing stuff.
We're running into this, by the way, in medical schools, where students are calling out professors for referring to people who are pregnant as women.
Right. Yeah, I saw that. Yeah, it's sick.
Now, what I'm struck with, when you're saying that you have to have a meta narrative because who does the dishes? What I'm struck by is how close this is to ancient paganism. If you are in the Roman Empire was really remarkably tolerant religiously. And that's because they were polytheistic. They could fully accept that different people will have different sets of gods, and we just incorporate all of them into the pantheon. Just make sure you burn incense to the emperor, and everything's fine. Okay. Yeah. So in a sense, it was an empire that had multiple meta-narratives in one sense, but there was still this sort of unifying factor. You salute the emperor, you pay your taxes, you support the military, or we will stomp you into the dirt. So there is an overarching something there, although it's not a meta-narrative in the normal sense of the word. They let people have their own stories, which is one of the reasons why, in a lot of ways, I argued since the book Why You Think the Way You Do, that when you take Christianity out of Western culture, all you're left with is Rome.
Yeah.
And functionally, what we've got now is a whole bunch of competing narratives enforced by a political hierarchy that claims to have a monopoly on force, that is willing to enforce certain kinds of decrees, but beyond that, they'll let you sort of pursue your own thing however you want to do it. I mean, in a lot of ways, we're back to Rome.
And there's this interesting thing that goes on with that. I mean, there's something I've been probing a lot of, though, is this tendency of especially now in history, but you could really argue that case even with the most extreme examples of National Socialism or Stalinism, is that you have something that they were very aware of in the academic world was a sort of a relative perspective being made absolute, if you will. Although I do think they really started to believe the kind of the grand narratives they were spinning. But one of the things that I think you had going on there is this turn to this kind of totalitarian tyranny to stifle any kind of dissent. that we're starting to see again with the woke crowd and the kind of we're seeing in the U.S. now, left and right, that anything that one could make an argument right now that the pressures they're putting on people, maybe for vaccinations or stuff, are of this nature of trying to increase that conformity, because what dissent does is it basically exposes the contingency of the power that needs to be absolute in everyone's mind. And so you can't have alternative narratives that question the absolute interpretation. I mean, look at the way big tech is functioning to silence any viewpoints that challenge the kind of, the main globalist interpretation of things, right? So anything that challenges it is a threat, right? Even if it's this little thread that you happen to post on your Facebook to your 20, 30, or a couple hundred friends or whatever, a couple thousand. I mean, the extreme measures they go to, for me, reveals how, on an existential level, contingent they realize their viewpoint is, and the only way to keep it from being removed or dismantled or challenged is to stifle all opposition. And this is why I think the sanctity of truth is I think step one. I think Rod Dreher tried to do a book around that off of Solzhenitsyn's idea,
Live not by lies.
Yes, but it's saying, it goes, I think, to the heart. I think, what is the Genesis account? But actually, Satan weaving this lie, the father of lies, that makes challenges kind of the divine interpretation of things, right? And then creates an alternate. And I think this shows the fragility of that alternate. I mean, these human narratives become basically the tool of those that can have, astronomical amounts of power. But there is this increased temptation when that gets ripped out of any kind of Christian view of transcendence and limits, to where basically all humans can be forced to that interpretation of what's good for everybody once it takes root.
Yeah, that's probably a good place to bring us into it for a landing here. I think if we're not going to have the true God who transcends and who is not threatened at all by our contingent efforts, then we're going to substitute some idol that is contingent and is willing to get pretty brutal. Anyway, as we wrap up, is there anything you wanted to say, Glenn, kind of sort of as a parting thought?
Oh, there were a boatload of things that went by so fast I couldn't quite dive in on them, but I think I'll save them for another time.
Okay. Well, we should probably wrap up. I do need to say a couple of things before we do, having to do with announcements and so forth. So we are going to be doing a live show at the Fight, Laugh, Feast conference. I think it's going to be in the Nashville area, but I think it's actually in Lebanon, Tennessee. But we'll be there, and we're going to be there doing a show with our friend George Grant, and we're looking forward to that. So we'll be one of the, I guess, quote, breakout sessions. They're telling me that we should expect maybe 500 to 1,000 people just at ours. So it's going to be a lot of fun to do a show in front of a live studio audience like that. But if you are kind of on the fence about whether or not to go to this Fight, Laugh, Feast conference, you probably should go because it's going to be a great time. There's going to be some great speakers. We got everybody from Vodi Bakum to Doug Tenapel there, and it's just going to be a lot of fun. And we'd love to meet you. And related to that, but not on the same, sort of or in the same place, we're working at pulling together our Pacific Northwest tour, and so we're looking at right now perhaps as many as 4 different locations that will be doing shows here in the Pacific Northwest, in the Portland area, in the Moscow area, and then a couple of places in the Seattle area. So anyway, that's going to be the last few days of October and the first few days of November. But that's coming up. I guess the one last thing to just say as we wrap up, we do appreciate the support that we receive. We get communication, we get texts, we get emails from folks all the time, and we're glad for those. We're also glad that many people support us financially. And so that does help because there are costs to producing the show, and all of those gifts go to those costs. We don't take any money for even our beer. So thank you very much. And if you've not rated us on iTunes or wherever you listen to us, please do. I'm told by the people who know how this stuff works that it helps. Anyway, with those things in mind, thanks again for listening to the Theology Pugcast, and we'll get together with you again, hopefully real soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.